The Grand Belmont Gala was the kind of evening where a single handshake could be worth more than most people's entire savings. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling of the Grand View Hotel ballroom like frozen waterfalls, throwing splinters of gold light across 300 of the city's wealthiest faces. Waiters in white gloves carried trays of champagne between clusters of men in tailored suits and women draped in jewelry that cost more than houses. Every year, the Belmont family hosted this event to remind the city who controlled the money, the influence, and the future. And every year, the city showed up. Because saying no to the Belmonts was the kind of mistake nobody made twice. Hannah Belmont stood near the back of the room, behind a tall marble column, close enough to the kitchen entrance that she could hear the clattering of dishes. She wore a navy blue dress that her mother had picked out for her 3 days ago. The only one in her closet that didn't draw the wrong kind of attention, as her mother had put it. Which really meant the only dress that kept Hannah invisible. She held a glass of sparkling water and watched her younger sister Evelyn glide through the center of the ballroom like the evening had been designed around her. And honestly, it had. The entire gala had been structured so that at exactly 9 o'clock, Julian Kane, one of the most powerful men on the eastern seaboard, would walk through those double doors and propose an alliance with the Belmont family. An alliance sealed through marriage to Evelyn. Everyone in the room already knew it. The photographers had been positioned. Evelyn's engagement outfit had been custom fitted by a designer flown in from Milan. Her father, Richard Belmont, had rehearsed his acceptance speech in his study that morning. Hannah had heard him through the wall while she was getting dressed. He'd practiced the part where he called Evelyn the crown jewel of our family 4 separate times. Hannah took a sip of her water. She'd learned a long time ago that being the other Belmont daughter meant standing where the light didn't reach. At exactly 2 minutes past 9, the ballroom doors opened. Julian Kane walked in alone. No entourage, no publicist. Just a man in a dark charcoal suit with a calm face and steady eyes that moved across the room like he was reading a blueprint. He was tall, with dark hair pushed back from his forehead, and he had the kind of quiet presence that made loud rooms go silent. The orchestra actually stumbled on a note when he appeared. 300 heads turned in unison. Richard Belmont moved first, crossing the ballroom floor with a wide smile and an outstretched hand. "Julian, my boy, welcome. We've been expecting you." Julian shook his hand once, firmly, and released it. "Thank you, Richard." Evelyn stepped forward, radiant under the light, every inch of her polished and perfect. She offered her hand with practiced elegance. "Mr. Kane, what a pleasure to finally meet you." Julian looked at her. He nodded once, the same way a person might acknowledge a painting on a wall. Polite, brief. Then his eyes moved past her, and that's when everything changed. Julian's gaze swept to the far corner of the room, past the clusters of socialites, past the champagne towers, past the photographers. It landed on Hannah, half hidden behind the marble column, holding her glass of sparkling water with both hands. He stared at her for exactly 3 seconds. Then he walked toward her. The crowd parted for him like water around a stone, and in the silence that followed, Hannah could hear her own heartbeat, louder than the orchestra. She almost looked behind her, half convinced he was walking toward someone else. There was nobody else back here. Just the kitchen entrance and a potted fern. Julian stopped 2 feet in front of her. "Hannah Belmont?" She blinked. "Yes?" "I came here tonight to make a proposal." His voice was steady, measured, and loud enough to carry across the now completely silent ballroom. "I'd like you to consider a partnership with me, a formal one. Marriage." The glass of sparkling water almost slipped from Hannah's fingers. She caught it, barely, and stared at him with wide eyes that couldn't seem to find a place to settle on his face. Behind Julian, the ballroom erupted. Richard Belmont's smile collapsed. Evelyn's perfect composure cracked straight down the middle. her lips parting in visible shock. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wind hitting a field of dry grass. "Excuse me?" Richard's voice cut through the murmuring. He crossed the room in long strides, his face darkening with every step. "Julian, I think there's been some confusion. We discussed this. The arrangement was for Evelyn." Julian turned his head just enough to look at Richard, and something in his expression made the older man slow down 3 feet short of reaching him. It was the kind of look that didn't threaten anything specific, yet somehow communicated that the conversation was already over. "There's no confusion, Richard." Julian's tone was even. "I've made my decision. I'm asking Hannah." "You can't be serious," Evelyn said, stepping forward, her voice tight. "You've never even met her." "I don't need your input on my choices," Julian said, without turning around. He looked back at Hannah. "You don't have to answer tonight. Take whatever time you need, but I want you to know the offer is real, and it's final." Hannah opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. The entire room was staring at her. 300 pairs of eyes, and she could feel each one. Her mother was somewhere to the left, frozen in place with a champagne flute halfway to her lips. Her uncle was at a table near the front, his fork suspended over a plate of salmon. Even the waiters had stopped moving. "I don't understand," Hannah said quietly. "Why me?" Julian held her gaze. "Because I've watched how this family operates for a long time, Hannah, and you're the only one in this room who's ever done anything worth respecting." The silence after that sentence could have filled a stadium. Richard Belmont looked like a man who'd just been told his bank account had been emptied overnight. His jaw worked, but nothing came out. Evelyn turned sharply on her heel and walked toward the bar, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown nobody wanted to hear. Julian reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and placed a small, cream-colored card on the edge of the nearest table. It had a phone number on it, nothing else. "When you're ready," he said, "call me." Then he turned and walked out of the ballroom, leaving behind 300 stunned guests, a family in chaos, and a woman standing behind a marble column who, for the first time in her life, had been seen by someone who actually mattered. The orchestra tried to start playing again, but nobody was listening anymore. Every conversation in the room had been replaced by a single question that nobody could answer. Why her? That question would follow Hannah Belmont out of the hotel, into her car, through her front door, and into her bed, where she would lie awake until sunrise, turning a small cream-colored card over and over in her fingers, wondering if the most powerful man she'd ever met was telling the truth, or setting the most elaborate trap she'd ever walked into. The lobby of the Grandview Hotel had emptied out faster than anyone expected. Guests who normally lingered until midnight, nursing their drinks and trading favors, were already pulling on their coats and heading for the exits. The gala had been gutted. Whatever magic the Belmont family had spent months preparing had evaporated the moment Julian Kane walked out of that ballroom. Hannah hadn't moved from the column. Her legs felt like they'd been filled with wet concrete, and every time she tried to take a step, another relative appeared in front of her with a question she couldn't answer. "What did you say to him?" her aunt demanded. "Nothing. I didn't say anything." "Did you contact him beforehand? Did you arrange this?" Her mother's voice was low and sharp, the kind of whisper designed to cut without leaving a mark. "Mom, I've never spoken to Julian Kane in my life." "Then explain to me how a man worth more than this entire building just proposed to you instead of your sister." Hannah had no explanation. She didn't even have a theory. The cream-colored card was still in her hand, the edges soft against her fingertips, and every few seconds she glanced down at it just to confirm it was real. Richard Belmont appeared from the private lounge behind the ballroom, his tie loosened, his face the color of old brick. He pointed a thick finger at Hannah from across the room. "You, with me, now." Hannah started walking toward him, but before she made it 3 steps, the lobby doors opened and a man in a dark suit stepped inside. He was young, clean-shaven, and moved with the kind of efficiency that came from years of following precise instructions.
Miss Belmont?
He looked directly at Hannah.
Yes? Mr. Kane sent me. He'd like to offer you a ride home, if you're comfortable with that. No obligations. He simply noticed that your family's evening has taken a difficult turn and wanted to make sure you had a way out.
Richard's face went from brick red to something closer to purple. She's not going anywhere with your people. She's a Belmont. The young man didn't even glance at Richard. His eyes stayed on Hannah.
The choice is entirely yours, Miss Belmont.
Hannah looked at her father. She looked at her mother, still standing near the bar with that tight expression she wore whenever something had gone publicly wrong. She looked at Evelyn, who was sitting alone at a corner table, staring at nothing, a full glass of champagne going flat in front of her. Then Hannah looked at the door.
Okay,
she said quietly.
I'll go.
She walked past her father without another word. Richard called after her twice, but she kept moving, her shoes clicking against the polished floor, her shoulders pulled back in a way that surprised even her. She didn't know where this courage was coming from. Maybe it wasn't courage at all. Maybe she was just tired. 28 years of standing behind columns and wearing dresses chosen to keep her invisible had finally run out of shelf life. Outside, 2 black SUVs idled at the curb, their engines humming low. The young man opened the rear door of the first vehicle, and Hannah climbed inside. The interior smelled like leather and cedar, and the seats were the kind that adjusted to your body the second you sat down. Julian Kane was sitting on the opposite side. "Thank you for coming," he said simply. Hannah buckled his seatbelt, mostly to give her hands something to do. "I don't know why I did. Probably because staying in that room was going to get worse by the minute." She almost laughed. "You'd be right about that." The SUV pulled away from the hotel, merging onto the expressway heading south. The city skyline shrank in the rearview mirror, its towers glittering against the dark sky like someone had scattered a handful of diamonds across a black tablecloth. For the first few minutes, neither of them spoke. The silence was strange because it wasn't uncomfortable. It just sat between them like a shared agreement that words could wait. Hannah broke it first. "You know my family is going to make this into a war." "They'll try," Julian said. "They won't succeed." "You sound very sure about that." "I've been watching your family's business operations for the last 2 years, Hannah. Their influence is built on image, not infrastructure. Once the image cracks, the whole thing starts leaking." He paused. "You already know this. You've seen it from the inside." She looked at him carefully. The passing streetlights cast moving shadows across his face, and in the brief flashes of light, she could see that his expression held no amusement, no smugness. He was stating facts the way a carpenter might describe the grain of a piece of wood. "Why do you know so much about my family?" she asked. "Because their interests overlap with mine in several areas. Commercial real estate, port logistics, charitable endowments. Your father has been trying to position Evelyn as a bridge into my networks for over a year. He thought a marriage arrangement would give him access to my distribution infrastructure." "And you went along with it?" "I went along with the gala invitation. I never agreed to Evelyn." Hannah turned that over in her mind. "So this was planned?" "The proposal, yes. The audience? That was your father's doing. I simply used the stage he built." The highway opened up ahead, wide and quiet, the suburbs approaching like a softer version of the world they'd just left behind. Hannah's neighborhood was modest by Belmont standards, a small house she rented with money she earned through her work at the rescue shelter. Her family had offered to buy her a condo in the city once, years ago. She'd turned it down because condos from the Belmonts always came with conditions. "What exactly are you offering me, Julian?" He turned slightly in his seat to face her. "Security, full financial independence, legal protection for your shelter and any other project you choose to pursue, and a partnership built on mutual respect, where you have equal say and full transparency into everything I do.
That sounds like a business proposal.
It is. At its core, every strong partnership is.
And what do you get?
Someone I can trust. That's harder to find than money. The SUV turned off the expressway onto a two-lane road lined with oak trees. Hannah's house appeared ahead, a small blue-sided bungalow with a porch light on and a pair of old sneakers sitting by the front door. Julian nodded to the driver, and the vehicle slowed to a stop.
"You're dropping me off here?"
Hannah said, surprised. "This is your home. I figured you'd want me to go to your place, sign something, start whatever this is tonight." Julian shook his head. "I'm not your father, Hannah. I don't make people do things on my schedule. Go inside, sleep on it, call me when you're ready. Or don't call me at all. The offer doesn't expire." Hannah stared at him for a long moment. Then she opened the door, stepped out onto her driveway, and stood there while the SUV pulled away, its taillights fading into the dark like two red eyes disappearing into a forest. She looked down at the cream-colored card still in her hand. Then she went inside, locked the door, sat down on her couch, and started thinking harder than she'd ever thought about anything in her entire life. 2 days passed, and Hannah didn't call. She went back to work at the Pause and Purpose Rescue Shelter the next morning like nothing had happened. Fed the dogs at 6:30, cleaned the cat enclosures by 8, answered 3 emails from potential adopters before lunch. The routine felt like armor, and she wore it gratefully. As long as she was measuring out kibble and refilling water bowls, she didn't have to think about cream-colored cards or charcoal suits, or the way 300 people had stared at her like she'd grown a second head. By the second day, she'd almost convinced herself that the whole thing had been a stunt. Rich men did strange things for complicated reasons, and Julian Kane was richer and stranger than most. Maybe he'd been trying to embarrass the Belmonts. Maybe it was a negotiation tactic, a way to knock Richard off balance before some deal she didn't know about. The proposal could have been a chess move dressed up as a gesture, and Hannah had simply been the nearest pawn. That explanation made sense. It was tidy. It let her keep her expectations exactly where they'd always been, which was somewhere around floor level. She was kneeling in the back kennel on the morning of the 3rd day, wrapping a fresh bandage around the hind leg of a 3-legged German shepherd named Captain, when she heard the front bell ring. The shelter didn't get many walk-ins before 10, so she figured it was the feed delivery guy dropping off the monthly grain shipment. "Be right there," she called out, pressing the medical tape down gently. Captain licked her wrist once, which was his way of saying he appreciated the effort but would prefer a treat instead. Hannah wiped her hands on her jeans, pushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and walked through the narrow hallway to the front reception area. Julian Kane was standing by the entrance, reading the adoption bulletin board like it was the morning newspaper. He was wearing a plain gray pullover, dark jeans, and boots that looked like they'd actually touched dirt before. No suit, no driver visible through the window, no bodyguards flanking the doorway. He looked like a regular person who'd wandered in off the street, except for the fact that his watch probably cost more than the building. Hannah stopped in the hallway.
"You're here."
Julian turned. "Good morning."
"How did you find this place?"
"It's listed on the county registry. You filed for a non-profit license 3 years ago under your own name." He glanced around the small lobby, taking in the hand-painted mural of dogs and cats on the far wall, the second-hand desk with its chipped corner, the stack of donation flyers held together with a rubber band. "You built this yourself?"
"Mostly. I had help from a few volunteers in the beginning, but they moved on. It's just me and a part-time vet tech now."
Julian nodded slowly. He didn't say anything for a moment, and Hannah realized he was actually looking at the place. Really looking. reading the evacuation plan taped to the wall, studying the schedule board with its color-coded feeding times, noticing the shelf of medication organized by species and dosage. Most people who visited the shelter saw a cramped, underfunded operation held together with duct tape and good intentions. Julian seemed to be seeing something else entirely. "Can I look around?" he asked. Hannah hesitated, then shrugged.
"Sure, watch your step in the back. Captain gets territorial about his blanket."
She gave him the tour, partly because she didn't know what else to do, and partly because the shelter was the one place in the world where she felt competent enough to lead. She showed him the kennel wing, where 14 dogs occupied spaces built for 10. She walked him through the cat room, a converted storage closet with climbing shelves she'd welded together from scrap metal. She pointed out the small yard out back where the animals got their outdoor time, fenced in with chain links she'd installed herself over a long weekend last spring. Julian asked questions, actual questions. How many animals cycled through per month? What her biggest expense was? Where the nearest emergency vet was located, and how long it took to get there? Whether the property's zoning allowed for expansion. Nobody had ever asked her those questions before. Her family certainly hadn't. Richard Belmont referred to the shelter as Hannah's little hobby whenever it came up in conversation, which was rarely. Evelyn had visited once, 2 years ago, stayed for 11 minutes, posted a selfie with a kitten for her social media, and never came back. They ended up in the small office at the back of the building, a room barely big enough for a desk and 2 folding chairs. Hannah sat on the edge of the desk. Julian took one of the folding chairs and lowered himself into it without any of the hesitation she might have expected from a man who probably sat in rooms with leather furniture and skyline views every day. "You're running this on personal savings," he said. It wasn't a question.
"And donations. We get a few hundred a month from the community. It covers food mostly. The vet bills are where it gets tight."
"Your family doesn't fund any of this?" Hannah laughed, short and dry.
"My family thinks this place is a waste of time. My father offered to buy the lot once, about a year ago. He wanted to tear it down and build a parking structure for one of his commercial properties."
Something shifted behind Julian's eyes. It was subtle, a brief tightening around the jaw, like a door closing inside a room she couldn't see. He reached into the back pocket of his jeans and pulled out a folded document. "I had my legal team prepare this yesterday," he said, setting it on the desk beside her. "Take your time reading it." Hannah unfolded the papers. It took her almost a full minute to process what she was holding. The document was a property deed transfer, assigning permanent land ownership of the shelter's lot and the 2 adjacent parcels directly to her name. Attached to it was a corporate funding agreement from one of Julian's legitimate holding companies, guaranteeing annual operational support for the shelter for the next 15 years. The agreement was structured so that no member of the Belmont family could contest, redirect, or dissolve the funding under any legal framework. Hannah read it twice. Then she looked up at Julian. "This is real? Signed and notarized this morning. You're giving me the land. I'm securing it. There's a difference. The land becomes yours legally, and no one in your family can touch it. The funding is routed through a foundation that operates independently of both your family and my personal accounts. Even if something happened to me tomorrow, the shelter stays funded." Hannah set the papers down on the desk. Her hands were trembling slightly, and she pressed them flat against the wood to steady them. She'd spent 3 years waking up at 5 in the morning to keep this place running. 3 years cutting her own meals short so the animals had enough. 3 years fielding calls from her father's lawyers trying to buy the lot out from under her. And now, a man she'd met 72 hours ago had just made the whole thing untouchable. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, and her voice cracked just enough on the last word that she looked away, embarrassed. Julian leaned forward slightly. "Because this place is the most honest thing I've seen in a long time. And because you deserve to know what it feels like when someone invests in what you've already built, instead of trying to tear it down." Hannah pressed her lips together hard. She picked up the papers again, smoothed them carefully, and folded them back along their original creases. "I haven't said yes to your proposal," she said quietly. "I know." "This doesn't change just because I might say no." "The deed is in your name, Hannah. It's yours regardless." She looked at him for a long time, searching his face the way she'd search an animal's eyes when it first arrived at the shelter, scared and defensive and unsure whether the hand reaching toward it meant safety or another round of pain. Whatever she found there made her exhale slowly, like she'd been holding a breath she didn't know she'd been carrying. "Okay," she said. "I'll think about it. Seriously this time." Julian stood up from the folding chair and extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was warm, firm, and brief. He left through the front door the same way he'd come in, alone and on foot, disappearing down the gravel road like any ordinary person heading home after a morning errand. Hannah stood in her tiny office, holding the deed to her shelter, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the future didn't feel like something she had to survive. It felt like something she might actually get to choose. Richard Belmont hadn't slept properly since the gala. His wife had stopped speaking to him 2 days ago, which was her way of communicating that the failure was entirely his fault. Evelyn had locked herself in her penthouse apartment and cancelled all her public appearances for the week. The family's publicist had already fielded 19 calls from society columnists wanting a comment on what everyone was now calling the Kane rejection. Richard sat in the back corner of the Kensington Club, a members-only establishment on the 14th floor of a limestone building in the city centre. The walls were panelled in dark walnut, the carpet was thick enough to swallow footsteps, and every table was spaced far enough apart that conversations stayed private. This was the kind of place where deals got made without paperwork, where handshakes carried the weight of contracts, and where men like Richard came to fix problems that couldn't be fixed in public. He checked his watch for the 3rd time. 2:15. His guest was late. The waiter brought him a second coffee, and Richard was stirring it when the chair across from him pulled back, and a man sat down with the ease of someone who'd been sitting in rooms like this his entire adult life. Marcus Vance was Julian Kane's second-in-command, and he looked the part. Mid-30s, square jaw, sharp eyes that catalogued everything in a room within the first 5 seconds. He wore a navy suit without a tie, and he carried himself with a kind of relaxed authority that came from years of operating in Julian's shadow and knowing exactly how much of that shadow he controlled.
"Mr. Belmont,"
Marcus said, signaling the waiter with 2 fingers. "Appreciate you reaching out." "I appreciate you showing up." Richard leaned forward. "I'll be direct. What happened at the gala was unacceptable. My family has spent 14 months building a relationship with Julian Kane. Evelyn was prepared. The alliance was structured. Everything was in place." Marcus ordered a sparkling water and waited for the waiter to leave. "I understand your frustration." "Frustration doesn't begin to cover it. My daughter was humiliated in front of every influential name in this city. I was humiliated. And for what? So Julian could make some kind of point by choosing Hannah?" Richard said her name like it left a bad taste. "Hannah runs a dog shelter. She has no social profile, no business acumen, no connections worth leveraging. This decision makes no strategic sense." Marcus tilted his head. "Have you considered that Julian might not be thinking strategically? Men like Julian Kane don't make public proposals on impulse. There's an angle here. I just can't see it." "Maybe there isn't one." Marcus took a slow sip of his water. "Julian has always had a sentimental streak. He hides it well, but it's there. It's the one part of him I've never been able to predict." Richard studied the younger man's face. He'd done his homework on Marcus Vance before arranging this meeting. Marcus had been Julian's right hand for 5 years, managing the operational side of Kane's sprawling enterprise, while Julian handled the public-facing decisions. Every shipment, every warehouse, every supply line ran through Marcus at some point. If Julian was the brain, Marcus was the circulatory system, and circulatory systems could be rerouted. Let me ask you something, Marcus. Richard lowered his voice. Are you satisfied with your current position? Marcus set his glass down carefully. That's a loaded question, Mr. Belmont. It's a practical one. You've been Julian's lieutenant for 5 years. You manage his logistics, his distribution, his operational infrastructure. You keep the machine running. And yet, when it came time to make the single biggest personal decision of his career, he didn't consult you. He didn't ask your opinion. He walked into my family's gala and made a choice that affects your entire organization without so much as a phone call to the man who runs half of it. The words landed exactly where Richard intended them to. Marcus's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted, a flicker of recognition, like a man hearing out loud a thought he'd been keeping to himself for months. What are you proposing? Marcus asked. Richard reached into his jacket and produced a thin leather portfolio. He slid it across the table. My family controls significant commercial real estate along the Eastern Port Corridor. 12 properties, all zoned for industrial and mixed-use operations. Combined assessed value is north of 40 million. I'm prepared to offer you exclusive management rights to the entire portfolio. Marcus opened the portfolio and scanned the first page. His eyes moved quickly, absorbing numbers and addresses with the efficiency of someone who thought in logistics. In exchange for what? He said without looking up. Access. Julian's distribution networks run through 3 key hubs in this city. I want a seat at the table for the Belmont family's commercial interests. Direct integration, no middlemen, no waiting for Julian's approval. You want to bypass Julian entirely. I want to work with someone who understands that business decisions should be made by businessmen, not by a man choosing his bride based on who feeds stray dogs. Marcus closed the portfolio. He leaned back in his chair and looked at Richard with an expression that hovered somewhere between amusement and calculation. That's a generous offer, Mr. Belmont. It's a strategic one. And if Julian finds out? Richard waved a hand. Julian is distracted. He's spending his mornings visiting animal shelters and signing over property deeds like a man planning a retirement instead of running an empire. By the time he notices anything has shifted, the new arrangement will already be operational. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. He picked up his glass, swirled the water once, and drank the rest of it in a single motion. Then he set the glass down, straightened his jacket, and extended his hand across the table. I'll need 72 hours to review the full terms, Marcus said. But in principle, I think we can work something out. Richard shook his hand with the satisfied grip of a man who believed he'd just bought back his family's standing with a single meeting. What Richard Belmont did not know, and wouldn't know until it was far too late, was that Marcus Vance had walked into the Kensington Club that afternoon with his own agenda already mapped out. The Belmont portfolio was a nice bonus, but Marcus didn't need Richard's real estate to do what he was planning. He'd been quietly repositioning Julian's supply lines for the past 4 months, skimming operational capacity from legitimate channels and rerouting it through contacts that answered to no one except Marcus himself. Richard thought he was recruiting a disloyal lieutenant. What he'd actually done was hand a set of keys to a man who was already building his own house. Marcus stepped out of the Kensington Club and walked 2 blocks south to where his car was parked on a side street. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through a series of encrypted messages from 3 different contacts, all confirming that the next round of redirected shipments would clear the port warehouse by Friday. He typed a single reply to all 3. Proceed as planned. Timeline moves up. Then he put the phone away, started the engine, and drove east toward the waterfront, where 47 shipping containers sat in a private lot under his name that Julian Kane didn't know existed. The game Richard Belmont thought he was starting had been underway for months, and neither he nor Julian had any idea how close the walls were to cracking. Hannah called Julian on the morning of day 6. She'd spent the previous 48 hours fielding calls from every branch of the Belmont family tree. Her uncle left 2 voicemails, each one longer and angrier than the last. Her cousin Diane sent a text message that was 11 paragraphs of unsolicited advice, most of it boiling down to, "Don't embarrass us further." Her mother showed up at the shelter unannounced on day 5, stood in the parking lot for 10 minutes, and then drove away without coming inside. That one hurt more than the voicemails. The only person who hadn't contacted her was Evelyn. That silence carried its own kind of weight. Julian picked up on the second ring.
"I've been thinking,"
Hannah said, sitting on the floor of the kennel with Captain's head resting on her knee. "And? I want to understand what I'm walking into. All of it. No edited version." "That's fair. Would you prefer to talk in person?" "Yes. I'll send a car at noon. I can drive myself." There was a brief pause on the other end. "Of course. I'll text you the address." The address led Hannah 40 minutes north of the city, past the commercial shipping docks and through a stretch of coastal highway that climbed along a series of rocky bluffs. The road narrowed to a single lane after the last intersection, flanked by mature oaks and a stone wall that ran for almost half a mile before reaching an iron gate with a security booth. The Kane compound sat on 11 acres of elevated ground overlooking the harbor. The main house was a 3-story stone and timber structure that looked like it had been built to outlast generations. Behind it, a series of smaller buildings connected by covered walkways spread across the property. Gardens, a greenhouse, a detached garage with enough space for a dozen vehicles. The whole place was ringed by a perimeter wall with camera mounts at regular intervals, discreet enough to blend into the landscaping, but visible enough to make a point. Hannah parked her 12-year-old sedan between a matte black Range Rover and something Italian that probably cost more than her entire block. She sat in the car for a full minute, looking at the front entrance, wondering what kind of person needed a home with its own security infrastructure. Julian met her at the door himself. No staff, no ceremony. He was wearing a dark sweater with the sleeves pushed up, and he held a ceramic mug in one hand. "Coffee?" he offered. "Sure." He led her through the main hallway, which was wider than her entire living room, and into a kitchen that managed to feel warm despite being roughly the size of a tennis court. Stone countertops, copper fixtures, a long wooden table near the windows that looked out over the harbor. He poured her a cup from a French press and set it in front of her without asking how she took it. There was already milk and sugar on the table. "So," Hannah said, wrapping her hands around the mug, "tell me what you actually do." Julian sat across from her. "My family built a logistics and distribution network over 3 decades. Shipping, warehousing, freight coordination. Some of it started in places that don't show up in annual reports, and I won't pretend otherwise. But over the last 8 years, I've been converting the entire operation into legitimate, registered enterprise. Every contract we hold today is clean. Every client is documented. The transition isn't finished, but it's past the point of no return. And the parts that aren't finished? Legacy relationships that take time to unwind. Old agreements with people who don't like change. I manage those carefully." Hannah looked at him over the rim of her mug. "People in this city call you a crime boss." "People in this city call a lot of things by the wrong name. I run a business. It has a complicated history. I'm not going to dress that up for you." She appreciated that. The Belmont family had spent her entire life dressing things up, and she'd developed a permanent allergy to varnish. "Why did you ask me to come here today?" she said. Julian set his mug down. "I received information 2 days ago that certain business rivals have taken an interest in our situation. Nothing direct, nothing immediate. But when people sense a shift in power dynamics, they start testing boundaries. Your name has come up in circles where I'd prefer it hadn't." Hannah's stomach tightened. "What does that mean?" "It means that for the time being, your suburban bungalow isn't the safest place for you to be. I'm asking you to consider staying here, at the compound, until I've resolved the situation.
You're asking me to move in?
I'm asking you to be somewhere with proper security while I handle a business problem. There's a difference. He stood and gestured toward the hallway. Let me show you something. He walked her through the east corridor of the house and up a flight of stairs to a wing she hadn't seen from the outside. It was a fully self-contained apartment. Living room, bedroom, a small kitchen, a private bathroom, and a study with bookshelves that someone had already stocked with a mix of veterinary science journals and contemporary fiction. The windows looked out over the gardens, and beyond them, the open water of the harbor. "This is yours," Julian said from the doorway. "Private entrance, separate key. Nobody comes in without your permission, including me." Hannah walked to the window and looked out. A pair of boats was crossing the harbor in the distance, their white sails catching the late afternoon light. "You set this up before I called you today," she said. "I set it up the day after the gala." "That's either very thoughtful or very presumptuous." "Probably both." She turned back to face him. "What about the shelter? I can't just disappear. The animals need daily care." "I've arranged for a licensed animal care team to cover your shifts whenever you need to be here. They'll report directly to you. Nothing changes at the shelter unless you authorize it." Hannah crossed her arms, then uncrossed them. She walked to the bookshelf and ran her fingers along the spines of the veterinary journals. Someone had included a copy of a livestock field medicine handbook that had been out of print for 6 years. She owned the same edition. It was sitting on her nightstand at home. "One more thing," Julian said. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a small black keycard. "This gives you full access to the property's security system. Camera feeds, gate logs, visitor records. Every person who enters or leaves this compound is logged. You can review it anytime you want." Hannah took the keycard. "You're giving me access to your own surveillance?" "I told you I'd hide nothing from you. This is what that looks like." She held the keycard between her thumb and forefinger, turning it over once. It was light, barely heavier than a credit card, but what it represented was something she'd never been offered by anyone in her life. Complete transparency from a man who had every reason in the world to keep secrets. "I'll stay," she said, "but I'm keeping my house. And I'm driving myself to the shelter every morning." "Understood." "And if I decide this isn't working, I leave. No questions, no negotiations." "The door is never locked from the inside, Hannah." She looked at him one more time, measuring the distance between what he was saying and what she was willing to believe. Then she nodded and set the keycard on the desk beside the window. "I'll go home and pack a bag," she said. "I'll be back tonight." Julian stepped aside to let her pass, and as she walked down the corridor toward the front entrance, she heard him say one more thing behind her, quiet enough that she almost missed it. "Thank you for trusting me." She didn't turn around, but she carried those words with her all the way to her car, through the iron gate, and down the coastal highway toward the city, where the evening skyline was beginning to light up like a promise she hadn't decided whether to keep. Hannah had been living at the Kane compound for 3 days, and she was beginning to understand why Julian ran his operation from home. The place functioned like a small city. Deliveries arrived at scheduled intervals through the service gate on the north side. Staff moved through designated corridors at predictable hours. The kitchen operated on a rotation that fed a security team of 12, a maintenance crew of 5, and a rotating cast of administrative personnel who occupied a cluster of offices in the West Wing. Everything had a rhythm, and Hannah, who had spent years managing the daily logistics of an underfunded animal shelter with zero margin for error, found herself paying attention to that rhythm the way a musician listens to an orchestra. When something was in tune, she didn't notice. When something was off, it stuck in her ear like a wrong note. She spent her mornings at the shelter, same as always. The licensed care team Julian had arranged turned out to be excellent, 3 professionals from a veterinary staffing agency who treated the animals with genuine care and followed Hannah's protocols without questioning them. She still handled the morning feedings herself because the routine grounded her, and Captain refused to eat from anyone else's hand anyway. By early afternoon, she'd drive back to the compound and settle into the logistics office on the ground floor of the main building. Julian had given her a workspace there so she could coordinate supply orders for the shelter using the compound's faster internet and shipping contacts. It was a practical arrangement, and it also happened to place her within earshot of the compound's central operations hub. The hub was a large room adjacent to the logistics office, separated by a glass partition and a door that was usually propped open. Inside, 3 monitors displayed live feeds from the gate cameras, delivery manifests scrolled across a shared screen, and a rotating schedule of personnel assignments covered one entire wall on a magnetic whiteboard. The room was staffed around the clock, but during the afternoon shift, it was usually quiet. 1 or 2 operators handling incoming calls, occasionally logging a delivery confirmation or updating a gate entry. Hannah liked working during those quiet hours. The hum of the monitors and the occasional crackle of a radio check created a kind of white noise that helped her concentrate. She'd spread her shelter paperwork across the desk, open her laptop, and lose herself in purchase orders for dog food and fencing materials. On the afternoon of her 3rd day at the compound, she was reviewing a bulk pricing quote from a feed supplier when she heard Marcus Vance's voice in the operations hub. Marcus came through the compound regularly. He had an office on the 2nd floor of the West Wing, though Hannah had noticed he rarely used it. He preferred to move through the building, checking in with staff, reviewing schedules in person, making calls from hallways. He had the kind of energy that didn't like sitting still, and he carried a leather folio under his arm at all times, like a security blanket made of spreadsheets. Today, he was standing at the delivery manifest screen with one of the logistics operators, a young man named Ellis who managed the shipping database. Marcus had his folio open and was pointing at something on the screen, while speaking in a low, steady voice. Hannah wasn't trying to listen. She was genuinely focused on her feed supplier quote. But Marcus was standing close enough to the glass partition that fragments of the conversation drifted through. Reroute the Bayside manifest to the secondary dock. Use the Friday window. Ellis hesitated. Friday? That slot's already allocated for the Hargrove delivery. Push Hargrove to Monday. Tell them we had a scheduling conflict with Port Authority. They won't check. Marcus, Julian approved the Hargrove timeline personally. If I move it without... I'll handle Julian. Just update the system. Ellis didn't argue further. His fingers moved across the keyboard, and the manifest screen refreshed with the new schedule. Marcus closed his folio, clapped Ellis on the shoulder, and walked out through the far door without glancing toward the logistics office. Hannah stared at her laptop screen for a long moment. Then she pulled up a blank spreadsheet and typed 2 lines from memory. The Bayside manifest, rerouted to secondary dock, Friday window. Hargrove delivery pushed to Monday, without Julian's knowledge. She didn't know what any of it meant. She didn't know what was in the Bayside shipment, or why Marcus wanted it moved. What she did know was that Marcus had just told a subordinate to override a schedule that Julian had personally approved, and he'd done it with the casual confidence of someone who'd done the same thing before. Over the next several hours, Hannah kept one eye on her shelter paperwork and the other on the operations hub. She wasn't watching Marcus specifically. She was watching the pattern. At 4:15, a delivery truck cleared the north gate. The gate log recorded it as a standard supply vehicle, but Hannah noticed that the truck's license plate didn't match any of the regular fleet numbers listed on the compound's approved vendor board. She'd memorized most of them over the past 3 days out of habit. Running a shelter meant knowing which trucks brought your supplies and which ones didn't belong in your parking lot. At 5:40, Ellis updated the manifest screen again, this time removing a line item entirely. Hannah couldn't see what the item was from her angle, but she watched Ellis glance toward the hallway twice before making the edit. The kind of look a person gives when they're checking whether anyone is watching. At 6:20, Marcus returned briefly to the hub, reviewed the updated screen, and left without speaking to anyone. On his way out, he passed within 3 feet of Hannah's open door. He glanced at her, smiled politely, and kept walking. It was the kind of smile that covered its own tracks. Hannah waited until the hub was empty, except for the night shift operator, a woman named Reese, who wore headphones and rarely looked up from her own console. Then she stood, stretched, and walked casually to the glass partition. The gate security log was still displayed on the secondary monitor. Hannah pulled out her phone and took 3 photographs of the screen, capturing the day's full entry and exit records. Then she walked back to her desk, sat down, and compared the gate log timestamps against the delivery manifest that was still visible on the shared screen. 2 entries didn't match. A truck that the manifest said had arrived at 3:10 was logged at the gate at 2:47. Another vehicle listed as departed at 4:30 had actually cleared the gate at 5:15. The gaps were small, 15 to 45 minutes, easy to dismiss as clerical errors or shift change delays. But Hannah had spent years reconciling purchase orders against delivery receipts for a shelter that couldn't afford to lose a single bag of kibble. She knew what clerical errors looked like. These weren't errors. These were adjustments. Someone had gone into the manifest after the fact and changed the timestamps to match a different narrative. Hannah saved the photographs to a locked folder on her phone and closed her laptop. She sat in the quiet office, listening to the hum of the monitors through the glass, and thought about what to do next. She could be wrong. She could be reading patterns where there were only coincidences, connecting dots that didn't actually form a picture. Marcus Vance had been Julian's most trusted lieutenant for 5 years. Questioning him based on a few mismatched timestamps and a rerouted delivery was the kind of thing that could blow up in her face and confirm every assumption her family had ever made about her. The fat sister who couldn't leave well enough alone. The one who always looked for problems because she didn't know how to fit in. But the numbers didn't lie. They never did. And Hannah Belmont had learned a long time ago to trust her eyes over everyone else's opinions. She picked up her phone and texted Julian a single line. "Can we talk tonight? Your library, just us." His reply came 40 seconds later. 9 o'clock, I'll be there. The library occupied the entire northeast corner of the compound's upper floor. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined 3 walls filled with a mix of hardcovers that looked red and leather-bound volumes that looked inherited. A large oak desk sat near the windows, and 2 armchairs faced each other beside a fireplace that hadn't been lit in what looked like years. The room smelled like old paper and cedar, and the only light came from a brass desk lamp and the distant glow of the harbor through the glass. Julian was already there when Hannah arrived at 9. He was sitting in one of the armchairs with a glass of water on the side table, reviewing something on a tablet. He set it face down when she walked in and gestured to the chair across from him. Hannah sat down. She'd spent the last 2 hours organizing her thoughts, arranging the information in her head the way she'd arrange a supply audit. Facts first, interpretation second, conclusions last. She'd learned that approach from running the shelter, where a misread inventory count could mean the difference between feeding every animal and running out of food on a Thursday. "Thank you for making time," she said. "You said just us. I cleared the floor. Nobody's in this wing except the perimeter watch, and they're outside." Hannah pulled out her phone and opened the locked folder. She placed the phone on the side table between them, screen facing up, showing the first photograph of the gate security log. "I want to preface this by saying I could be completely wrong," she said. "And if I am, I'll apologize and we can forget this conversation happened." Julian leaned forward slightly. "Go ahead." "I've been working in the logistics office for the past 3 days. It's next to the operations hub, and the glass partition doesn't block much. I've had a clear line of sight to the delivery manifests and gate logs while I've been doing my shelter paperwork." She swiped to the second photograph. "Yesterday afternoon, I watched Marcus instruct one of your operators, Ellis, to reroute a Bayside manifest to a secondary dock using a Friday delivery window. Ellis told him the Friday slot was already reserved for a Hargrove delivery that you'd approved personally. Marcus told him to push Hargrove to Monday and said he'd handle you himself. Julian's expression didn't change, but his eyes moved from the phone screen to Hannah's face. He was listening with the kind of focus she imagined he brought to every conversation that mattered.
That caught my attention,
Hannah continued. So I started watching more carefully. Over the next few hours, I noticed 3 things. First, a delivery truck came through the north gate with a plate number that doesn't match any vehicle on your approved vendor list. I've been sitting near that board for 3 days, and I've memorized most of the fleet numbers. This one wasn't on it. She swiped to the 3rd photograph. Second, Ellis deleted a line item from the manifest screen around 5:40. I couldn't see what it was, but he checked the hallway twice before making the edit. Third, when I compared the gate log timestamps against the delivery manifest after the shift ended, 2 entries didn't match. A truck logged at the gate at 2:47 was listed on the manifest as arriving at 3:10. Another vehicle that cleared the gate at 5:15 was recorded on the manifest as departing at 4:30. She set the phone down and sat back. The discrepancies are small. 15 minutes here, 45 minutes there. They could be shift change delays or manual entry errors, but the timestamps were changed after the fact. The gate log is automated. The manifest is manually updated. Someone edited the manifest to create a different timeline than what actually happened. The room was quiet. The brass lamp hummed faintly, and somewhere outside, a boat horn sounded across the harbor. Julian hadn't moved from his position, but something in the air between them had shifted. It was the kind of silence that happens when someone is recalculating everything they thought they knew. "Marcus has been with me for 5 years, Julian said. His voice was even, but there was a weight behind it that hadn't been there a minute ago. "I know. He was the first person I promoted when I took over operations from my father. He built half the distribution infrastructure we use today. Every warehouse rotation, every vendor contract, every security protocol for the shipping division came through his office." "I know," Hannah said again. "That's why I almost didn't bring this to you." Julian picked up his glass of water, looked at it, and set it back down without drinking. "What made you decide to bring it anyway?" Hannah thought about that for a moment. She wanted to give him an honest answer, partly because he'd been honest with her from the beginning, and partly because dishonest answers had a way of collapsing under their own weight. "Because you gave me a keycard to your entire security system on my first day here," she said. "You told me you'd hide nothing from me. If I saw something and kept it to myself, I'd be doing exactly what you promised you wouldn't do. And I'm not interested in being that kind of person, even if it means telling you something you don't want to hear." Julian studied her face for a long time. Hannah held his gaze. She'd spent enough years being looked past and looked through to know the difference between someone dismissing her and someone truly seeing her. Julian was doing the latter, and it made the back of her neck warm. "If you're right," he said slowly, "then Marcus has been running a parallel operation inside my own network, using my infrastructure, my personnel, my shipping routes, rerouting legitimate cargo to cover unauthorized movement." "That's what the pattern suggests, but I only have 3 days of observation and a handful of mismatched timestamps. I could be reading this wrong." "You're not reading it wrong." Julian's jaw tightened. "You're reading it the way someone reads it when they don't have a reason to look away." He stood up and walked to the window. The harbor was dark except for the navigation lights of cargo ships anchored in the outer channel. He stood there for almost a full minute, his hands in his pockets, his reflection ghosted in the glass. "I'm not going to confront him," Julian said finally. Hannah frowned. "Why?" "Because confrontation gives him time to cover his tracks. If Marcus is running a side operation, he's been planning it for months. He'll have contingencies. Dead drops, backup contacts, fail-safe arrangements. If I tip him off, everything goes underground, and I lose the trail." He turned back to face her. I'm going to run a quiet audit, internal only. My chief of security, a man named Cole, is the only person besides you that I trust completely. I'll have Cole pull the original gate logs from the server backup and cross-reference them against every manifest Marcus has touched in the last 6 months. What about Ellis? Hannah asked. He made the edits Marcus asked for. He might talk. Ellis is 23 years old and scared of Marcus. He won't talk because Marcus told him not to. But he also won't delete the server-side backups because he doesn't have access to them. Only Cole and I do. Julian walked back to the armchair and sat down. He looked at Hannah with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. It was something close to gratitude, but deeper, more grounded. The kind of recognition that comes when someone earns your trust in a way you weren't expecting. You could have ignored this, he said. You could have decided it wasn't your problem, kept your head down, and focused on your shelter. Nobody would have blamed you. I would have blamed me, Hannah said. Julian nodded once. I'll start the audit tomorrow, quietly. And I need you to keep doing exactly what you've been doing. Work in the logistics office, maintain your routine, and don't change a single thing about how you interact with Marcus. You want me to act normal. I want you to be yourself. That's what got us here. Hannah stood up, picked up her phone, and slipped it into a pocket. She paused at the doorway and looked back at him. Julian, if I'm right about this, and Marcus has been doing what I think he's doing, the problem is bigger than a few rerouted shipments. I know, he said quietly. That's what worries me. She left the library and walked down the corridor to her wing, her footsteps soft against the hard wood. The compound was silent around her, every door closed, every hallway empty. Somewhere below, the security monitors hummed their constant watch, recording every entry and exit, every timestamp and license plate, building a record that someone had tried very hard to edit. Hannah locked her door, sat on the edge of her bed, and exhaled. She'd done the right thing. She was certain of that. What she wasn't certain of was what the right thing was going to cost. Cole Brannigan had been Julian Kane's chief of security for 9 years, which was 4 years longer than Marcus Vance had held any position in the organization. He was a compact man in his late 40s, with gray at the temples, a permanent squint from years of reading surveillance footage in dim rooms, and a voice that never rose above conversational volume, regardless of the circumstances. Julian had once said that Cole was the kind of man who could walk through a crowded room and leave no memory of having been there. It took Cole 72 hours to complete the preliminary audit. He worked from a secure terminal in a basement office that didn't appear on any floor plan of the compound. The room had been built during Julian's father's era, originally intended as a communications center, and it still had the reinforced walls and independent power supply that made it impossible to monitor from outside. Cole pulled 6 months of server-side gate logs, cross-referenced them against every delivery manifest that had passed through Marcus's division, and compiled the results into a single encrypted file that he hand-delivered to Julian on a flash drive at 6 in the morning on day 15. Julian reviewed the file in his library with the door locked. The findings confirmed everything Hannah had observed, and then some. Over the past 4 months, Marcus had altered delivery manifests on 23 separate occasions. Each alteration involved rerouting cargo from Julian's legitimate shipping partners to a secondary dock on the industrial waterfront, a dock that was leased under a shell company Cole had traced back to an associate named Devlin Marsh. Marsh was a mid-level freight broker who had been blacklisted from Julian's network 2 years ago for falsifying insurance documents. The fact that Marcus was doing business with someone Julian had personally cut off was significant on its own. The volume of cargo being redirected made it something else entirely. Julian closed the file, removed the flash drive, and called Cole. "Tonight," Julian said. "The Bayside warehouse, you and me, nobody else."
What time?
11. Use the east access road. Park off-site and walk in.
Do you want tactical support?
No. If Marcus has people at the warehouse, a convoy will spook them. 2 men doing a quiet inspection draws less attention than a full team. Cole paused.
And if we find what I think we're going to find?
Then we document everything. Photographs, inventory counts, shipping labels, every crate, every pallet, every manifest on site. I want a record so clean that Marcus couldn't challenge it if he hired every lawyer in the state. The Bayside warehouse sat at the eastern edge of the city's industrial waterfront, a long, corrugated steel building sandwiched between a container yard and a defunct cold storage facility. During the day, it handled overflow freight from Julian's primary distribution hub, mostly commercial goods bound for regional retail partners. At night, the building was supposed to be locked, alarmed, and monitored by a rotating pair of security guards from Julian's own team. Julian and Cole arrived on foot at 11:15, approaching from the East Access Road through a narrow service alley that ran behind the container yard. The night was cool, and the smell of diesel and salt water hung in the air like a permanent resident. The harbor was visible from the alley, its dark water reflecting the amber lights of the cargo cranes that lined the far shore. The warehouse's exterior lights were off. That was the first problem. Julian's operational protocol required all perimeter lighting to remain active during non-business hours. The security booth near the loading dock was empty. That was the second problem. Cole checked the main entry panel. The alarm system had been disabled using a master override code, the same code that was issued exclusively to senior division managers. Marcus was one of 3 people who had that code. They entered through the side personnel door and moved through the building methodically, bay by bay. The front section of the warehouse looked normal. Pallets of consumer electronics, cases of imported textiles, stacks of boxed restaurant equipment, all tagged with Julian's standard shipping labels and arranged according to the grid system his logistics team used across every facility. The back section was a different story. Behind a partition wall that had been installed recently enough that the drywall seams were still visible, 47 shipping containers occupied a space that shouldn't have existed. The containers were unmarked, which violated Julian's labeling policy. Each one bore a small adhesive tag on the lower right corner with a coded identifier that didn't correspond to any system Julian recognized. Cole photographed the partition wall, the containers, and every adhesive tag. Julian walked the rows slowly, stopping at each container, checking the seals. 12 of them were open. Inside, he found commercial freight that matched shipments his legitimate partners had reported as delayed or lost in transit over the past 3 months. Electronics that a retailer in the Northeast had written off as missing. Textiles that a distributor in the Mid-Atlantic had filed insurance claims on. Restaurant equipment that a franchise group had reordered after their original shipment supposedly vanished during port processing. Marcus hadn't been stealing from Julian directly. He'd been intercepting shipments from Julian's clients, rerouting them through the shell company, and letting the clients believe the goods were lost. The clients filed insurance claims, absorbed the cost, and reordered. Meanwhile, Marcus stockpiled the original shipments in this warehouse, presumably to resell them through Devlin Marsh's network at pure profit, since the goods had already been paid for by both the original buyer and their insurance provider. It was elegant in a way that made Julian's jaw clench. Marcus had used Julian's own infrastructure to build a parallel business that fed off the trust Julian's clients placed in his operation. Every delayed shipment, every lost cargo report, every frustrated phone call from a partner wondering why their goods hadn't arrived was a wound in Julian's reputation that Marcus had inflicted deliberately. Julian stood in the center of the hidden section and looked at the rows of stolen containers. Cole stood beside him, camera in hand, waiting. "How much?" Julian asked quietly. Cole checked his notes. "Based on the manifests I've audited, the total value of redirected goods over the past 4 months is somewhere between 3 and 4 million. That's conservative. There could be more at other locations." "Other locations?" Devlin Marsh leases warehouse space at 2 additional sites along the waterfront. I haven't been able to inspect those yet, but the shell company records show regular activity at both addresses. Julian nodded. He pulled out his phone and took his own set of photographs, capturing wide shots of the hidden section, close-ups of the container tags, and detailed images of the opened crates showing the original shipping labels with his clients' names and order numbers. "Get me a complete inventory of everything in this room," Julian said. "Every container, every crate, every item. Match it against the client loss reports from the past 6 months. I want a side-by-side comparison showing exactly what was reported missing and exactly where it ended up." Timeline? 3 days. The boardroom meeting is on day 18. I want the full package ready by then. Cole tucked the camera into his jacket and started a systematic count from the first row. Julian walked back through the partition opening into the legitimate section of the warehouse, past the neatly labeled pallets and properly tagged inventory that had made this facility look clean from the outside. He stepped out into the night air and stood by the loading dock, looking across the dark water of the harbor. A cargo ship was moving through the outer channel, its running lights tracing a slow path toward the open sea. Somewhere on that ship, or on another one just like it, goods were moving through routes that Marcus had corrupted from the inside. 5 years. Julian had trusted this man for 5 years. He'd given Marcus access to every corridor of the operation, every vendor relationship, every security protocol. And Marcus had used that access to build a machine that was slowly eating Julian's business from the inside out. A week ago, Hannah Belmont had sat in his library with a handful of photographs and a theory built on mismatched timestamps. She'd apologized in advance for possibly being wrong. She hadn't been wrong about a single detail. Julian put his phone away, turned back toward the warehouse, and went inside to help Cole finish the count. The evidence had to be perfect. When the time came to sit Marcus down in that boardroom, there would be no room for denial, no space for excuses, and no second chance. The numbers would speak for themselves. They always did. The conference room occupied the entire 32nd floor of the Kane Financial Tower in the city's central business district. Glass walls on 3 sides offered an unbroken view of the skyline, and the 4th wall held a row of mounted screens used for presentations during quarterly reviews. A long mahogany table ran the length of the room, surrounded by 18 high-backed chairs, each one reserved for a senior captain or department head in Julian's organization. By 8:45 on the morning of day 18, every chair was filled. Julian had sent the meeting notice 12 hours earlier, tagged as mandatory, with no agenda attached. That alone had been enough to set nerves on edge. Julian's regular operations meetings were scheduled weeks in advance, with detailed briefing packets distributed to every attendee. An unscheduled mandatory meeting with no agenda meant one of 2 things. Either something very good had happened, or someone in the room was about to have a very bad morning. Marcus Vance arrived at 8:30, 15 minutes early, which was his habit. He took his usual seat at the far end of the table, directly opposite Julian's chair, and arranged his leather folio and phone in front of him with the practiced ease of a man who had sat through 100 of these meetings and expected this one to be no different. He chatted briefly with the head of the commercial real estate division, a woman named Priya Chen, about a tenant dispute at one of their downtown properties. He poured himself a glass of water from the carafe on the table. He adjusted his cuffs. At exactly 9 o'clock, Julian walked in. He was carrying a single black binder. Cole Brannigan followed 2 steps behind, holding a laptop, and took a seat near the door rather than at the table. That detail caught Marcus's eye. Cole usually stood outside during operations meetings. His presence inside the room was a deviation from years of established protocol. Julian sat down, placed the binder on the table, and looked around the room. He made eye contact with every person seated, one by one, moving clockwise from his left. When his gaze reached Marcus at the far end, He held it for exactly the same duration as everyone else, no longer, no shorter. Then he opened the binder. "Thank you all for being here on short notice," Julian said. "I'll keep this efficient. 3 days ago, I conducted an unannounced inspection of our Bayside warehouse facility. The inspection was prompted by discrepancies identified during a routine internal review of our delivery manifests and gate security logs. The room was already quiet, but a different kind of stillness settled over it now. The kind where people stop blinking." Julian turned to the first page of the binder. Over the past 4 months, 23 delivery manifests processed through our Eastern Distribution Division have been altered after initial entry. In each case, cargo designated for our legitimate shipping partners was rerouted to a secondary dock leased under a shell company called Coastline Freight Holdings. That company is operated by Devlin Marsh, a freight broker who was removed from our approved vendor network 2 years ago. He turned to the second page. The rerouted cargo was intercepted before reaching its intended recipients and stored in a concealed section of the Bayside warehouse behind a partition wall that was constructed without authorization approximately 4 months ago. At the time of inspection, 47 unmarked containers were recovered. Their contents match goods that our clients reported as lost or delayed in transit, goods for which insurance claims were subsequently filed and paid. Julian looked up from the binder. Every face around the table was rigid. Priya Chen had her hands flat on the table like she was bracing for turbulence. The head of port operations, a man named Decker, was staring at his own reflection in the polished surface of the mahogany. Nobody was looking at Marcus. Marcus was looking at Julian. His expression hadn't changed. The water glass in front of him was untouched. His folio remained closed. Julian continued. "The total estimated value of redirected goods is $3.7 million. The financial impact to our client relationships is still being calculated, but preliminary assessments suggest that at least 9 of our long-term shipping partners have experienced service disruptions directly attributable to these diversions." He turned to the third page, which contained a series of printed photographs. The hidden warehouse section, the unmarked containers, the adhesive tags, the opened crates showing original shipping labels with client names and order numbers. Julian slid the page across the table, and it was passed from hand to hand around the room like a document nobody wanted to hold for too long. "The manifests that were altered all passed through a single division," Julian said. "All 23 rerouting orders were executed using a senior override code assigned to that division's commanding officer." He paused. "The Eastern Distribution Division is managed by Marcus Vance." The room didn't gasp. It did something worse. It went absolutely dead. The air conditioning hummed overhead, and somewhere far below, the city moved through its ordinary morning, completely unaware of what was happening on the 32nd floor. Marcus set both hands on the table. His fingers were steady. His face was composed. He looked at Julian with an expression that carried no surprise, no panic, and no contrition. It was the face of a man who had prepared for several possible outcomes and was now calculating which response best served his interests. "Julian," Marcus said calmly, "I'd like the opportunity to provide context." "There's no context required," Julian replied. "The audit is complete. The evidence is documented. Every manifest alteration has been traced, every container has been inventoried, and every financial transaction connected to Coastline Freight Holdings has been flagged for review. This isn't a discussion, Marcus. It's a notification." Julian closed the binder. "Effective immediately, you are relieved of all operational responsibilities within this organization. Your access credentials for every facility, database, and communication system have been revoked as of 7 o'clock this morning. Your personal belongings from your office and compound quarters have been packed and will be delivered to an address of your choosing by end of day." Marcus's jaw tightened. It was the first visible crack in his composure since the meeting began. "You're making a mistake. I made the mistake 5 years ago when I gave you unsupervised access to the infrastructure my father built," Julian said evenly. "I'm correcting it now." The room remained frozen. Nobody spoke. Nobody shifted in their seat. 16 senior leaders sat perfectly still, while the 17th was dismantled in front of them with the precision of a surgeon removing a splinter. Julian nodded toward Cole, who stood and opened the conference room door. 2 members of the compound security team stepped inside, both in plain suits, both carrying themselves with the quiet professionalism that Cole trained into every member of his staff. "Cole will escort you from the building," Julian said. "Your severance terms and legal obligations will be delivered to your attorney by tomorrow morning. If you cooperate with the transition, this stays internal. If you don't, the client loss reports and the shell company records go to every partner in our network, and your name goes on a list that nobody in this industry wants to be on." Marcus looked around the table one final time. 16 faces looked back at him, and each one carried the same expression, the careful blankness of people who were grateful beyond measure that it wasn't their name attached to that binder. Marcus stood, buttoned his jacket, picked up his folio, and walked to the door without another word. Cole fell into step beside him, and the 2 security officers followed. The door closed behind them with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have. Julian waited 10 seconds. Then he opened the binder again and turned to a fresh section.
"Decker, you'll assume interim oversight of Eastern distribution, effective today. Priya, I'll need a client impact assessment on my desk by Thursday. Everyone else, operational priorities remain unchanged. We have partners who are owed explanations and shipments that need to be made right. Let's get to work." Chairs moved, voices returned. The room came back to life like a machine that had been briefly unplugged and was now running clean again. Julian gathered the binder, stood, and walked to the window. Below him, the city spread out in every direction, its towers and streets carrying on with the ordinary business of a Tuesday morning. He thought about Hannah, sitting in the logistics office at the compound, reviewing shelter supply orders with the same careful attention that had uncovered everything contained in the binder he was holding. He owed her a conversation. Several, in fact. But first, he had 9 client relationships to repair, a distribution network to rebuild from the inside, and a message to send to every remaining member of his organization. Trust was the most expensive thing he dealt in, and the cost of betrayal had just been made very clear. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon, 2 days after Marcus Vance had been escorted out of the Kane Financial Tower. Hannah was in the compound's greenhouse, repotting a row of basil plants she'd started growing the previous week, when her phone buzzed with a number she hadn't seen on her screen in almost a month. Her mother. Hannah wiped her hands on her apron, stared at the phone through 2 full rings, and picked up on the third. "Hannah." Her mother's voice carried the particular strain of someone who had rehearsed the first line of a conversation and was already struggling with the second. "I'm calling because your father would like to invite you and Mr. Kane to the house this Friday. For tea. In the garden." Hannah almost laughed. Tea in the garden was the Belmont family's version of a white flag. It was the setting reserved for conversations that were too important for phone calls and too delicate for public restaurants. Every major reconciliation, negotiation, and carefully staged apology in Belmont history had taken place in those gardens, between the rose beds and the stone fountain that Richard had imported from a villa in Tuscany. "Why?" Hannah asked. "Because your father has had time to reflect, and he believes a conversation is overdue." "Mom, Dad hasn't reflected on anything since the day he decided Evelyn was the family's only viable asset. He's not calling because he's had a change of heart. He's calling because Julian just publicly removed his second-in-command, and the entire business community is talking about how stable the Kane operation still is. Dad's leverage disappeared when Marcus walked out of that building."
The silence on the other end lasted long enough that Hannah could hear the grandfather clock ticking in her mother's sitting room. "Will you come or not?" her mother asked, the rehearsed warmth already fading. Hannah looked at the basil plants. Their leaves were bright green, sturdy, growing toward the light the way living things do when they're finally planted in the right soil. "I'll ask Julian," she said. "If he's available, we'll be there Friday." Julian was available. He listened to Hannah's summary of the call while they sat in the compound kitchen that evening, and his only question was whether she wanted him there as support or as a participant. "Both," she said. "But I need to do most of the talking. This is a conversation I've been putting off for about 20 years. "Understood. I'll follow your lead." Friday arrived with the kind of cloudless autumn sky that made everything look sharper than usual. The Belmont estate sat on 4 acres of landscaped property in the city's most exclusive residential corridor, a Georgian revival mansion with white columns and a circular driveway that could accommodate 12 cars comfortably. Hannah had grown up in this house, walked these hallways, eaten at the long dining table where her family had spent years talking around her rather than to her. Julian's driver pulled up to the front entrance at exactly 2 o'clock. Hannah stepped out, wearing a dark green dress she'd bought the day before, the first piece of clothing she'd chosen for herself since the gala. Julian walked beside her in a charcoal blazer, no tie, hands at his sides. They looked like 2 people arriving for a business meeting, which, in many ways, they were. Richard Belmont was waiting in the garden, standing near the stone fountain with his hands clasped behind his back. He wore a sport coat despite the warmth, which was his way of maintaining formality even in his own backyard. Hannah's mother, Diane, sat at the wrought iron table beneath the pergola, a teapot and 4 cups already arranged on a linen cloth. She smiled when she saw Hannah, and the smile was close enough to genuine that it stung a little. Evelyn was not present. Hannah had expected that. Richard stepped forward and extended his hand to Julian first. "Thank you for coming." Julian shook it briefly. "Thank you for the invitation." Then Richard turned to Hannah. He looked at her the way a man looks at a landscape that has changed since the last time he visited. Familiar in outline, but different in every important detail. Hannah stood still and let him look. "You look well," Richard said.
"I am well."
They sat at the table. Diane poured tea with the practiced precision of someone who had hosted these conversations many times before. For the first minute, nobody spoke. The fountain murmured behind them, and a pair of sparrows chased each other through the rose beds. Richard cleared his throat. "I want to acknowledge that the way our family handled the events at the gala was beneath us. You deserved better than what you received that night and in the weeks that followed." Hannah wrapped her hands around her teacup. "Which part are you apologizing for, Dad? The part where you spent 14 months planning my sister's engagement without telling me? The part where you and Mom picked out a dress designed to keep me invisible? Or the part where you tried to drag me into a private room after Julian left, like I'd done something wrong by being chosen?" Richard's jaw worked. Diane set down her teacup with a faint clink. "I'm not here to relitigate every grievance," Richard said carefully. "I'm not either. But I need you to hear something, and I need you to hear it clearly." Hannah set her cup down and looked directly at her father. "For 28 years, I have lived in this family as an afterthought. Every decision that mattered was made around Evelyn. Every resource, every opportunity, every introduction went to her because she fit the image you wanted to project. I was the sister who got the leftover attention, the one you mentioned at parties only when someone specifically asked for." Richard opened his mouth. Hannah held up a hand. "I'm not finished. When I opened the shelter 3 years ago, you offered to buy the property out from under me. When I asked for a small loan to expand the kennel wing, you told me to come back when I had a real business plan. When I filed for non-profit status, you told Mom it was embarrassing that a Belmont was running a charity for stray dogs. I heard you, Dad. Through the wall of your study, I heard every word." The garden was quiet. Even the sparrows had stopped. I didn't come here today to fight with you, Hannah continued. And I didn't come here to ask for your approval because I don't need it anymore. My shelter is fully funded. The land is in my name. I have a partner who treats my work with respect and my judgment with trust. Everything I spent years begging this family to give me, I found somewhere else. She paused and took a breath. What I am willing to offer is a relationship going forward that is honest, where you treat me like an adult and not like a problem you're managing, where you stop trying to control my choices and start recognizing that I've built something meaningful on my own. If you can do that, then we can move forward. If you can't, I'll walk out of this garden and you won't hear from me again. The weight of that last sentence settled over the table like a change in air pressure. Richard looked at Diane. Diane looked at her hands. Julian sat perfectly still beside Hannah, his presence steady and silent, exactly as she'd asked. Richard Belmont was not a man who apologized easily. He had built his career on certainty and control, and admitting that he had been wrong about his own daughter required dismantling a version of himself he'd been constructing for decades. But he was also a man who could read a room, and the room he was sitting in right now had only one possible outcome that didn't end with him losing his daughter permanently. "I hear you," Richard said slowly, "and I'm sorry, genuinely." Hannah studied his face. She'd spent a lifetime learning to read the difference between words people meant and words people performed. Her father's expression held something she hadn't seen there before, an uncertainty that came from realizing he was no longer the most powerful person at the table. "Okay," Hannah said. "Then we start fresh. On my terms." Richard nodded. Diane reached across the table and touched Hannah's hand briefly. It was the most honest gesture her mother had offered in years. Julian caught Hannah's eye across the table and gave her the smallest nod, barely visible, the kind of acknowledgement that said everything without needing a single word. They stayed for another 20 minutes. The conversation shifted to lighter ground, Diane's garden plans for the spring, a charity gala the city's arts council was organizing. Nobody mentioned Evelyn. Nobody mentioned Marcus Vance. The afternoon light softened across the garden, and for the first time in Hannah's memory, a conversation with her family ended without her feeling smaller than when it began. In the car on the way back to the compound, Hannah leaned her head against the window and watched the city pass by. "You didn't say a word in there," she said. Julian glanced at her. "You didn't need me to." She smiled. It was small and tired and real. "No," she said. "I didn't." The city center observatory had been closed to the public for 3 years, ever since the foundation that managed it ran out of funding and the building was absorbed into a private trust. Julian had acquired it 18 months ago through one of his holding companies, originally intending to convert it into office space for his charitable operations. But the building resisted renovation the way old buildings sometimes do, by being too beautiful to change. The domed ceiling still held its original copper framework, the observation deck wrapped around the entire top floor in a continuous band of glass that offered an unbroken view of the skyline in every direction. And the open-air terrace on the roof, accessible by a narrow iron staircase, sat high enough above the surrounding towers that standing on it felt like being suspended between the city and the sky. Hannah had suggested the observatory for the gathering. Julian had planned to use the penthouse suite at the Kane Financial Tower, which had hosted every formal event his organization had held for the past decade. But Hannah pointed out that the penthouse carried the weight of everything Julian's name had meant before she'd entered the picture. If they were going to announce a new chapter, they should do it somewhere that didn't smell like the old one. Julian agreed within 30 seconds. It was becoming a pattern. The guest list was kept to 40. No society columnists, no photographers, no political figures angling for handshake opportunities. Every person who received an invitation had earned their presence through direct involvement in either Julian's legitimate business operations or Hannah's expanding network of charitable projects. There were foundation directors, shelter network coordinators, commercial partners whose shipments had been restored and whose trust Julian had spent the past week personally rebuilding, one client meeting at a time. The evening of day 25 arrived cool and clear, the kind of autumn night where the air carries sound farther than usual and the city lights look close enough to touch. Hannah stood on the observation deck at 6:30, a full hour before guests were expected, watching the sunset paint the western skyline in shades of copper and deep blue. She wore a burgundy dress with long sleeves that she'd picked out herself from a shop downtown. No stylist, no second opinion, no mother standing behind her suggesting something less noticeable. Her hair was pulled back in a simple twist, and she wore small gold earrings that had belonged to her grandmother, the only Belmont family heirloom she'd ever asked to keep.
Julian found her there, leaning against the railing with her arms crossed over the glass. "You're early," he said.
I wanted to see it before anyone else got here, when it's still quiet.
He stood beside her and looked out at the same view. Below them, the city moved through its evening transition, office lights clicking off in waves, while restaurant signs and street lamps flickered on to replace them. The harbor was visible to the east, its dark water catching the last traces of sunlight like scattered coins. "Are you nervous?" he asked.
A little.
"You?"
I don't get nervous.
Hannah looked at him sideways. "You got nervous when I brought you those security log photos." Julian considered that. That wasn't nervousness. That was the feeling of realizing someone you trusted had been lying to you for months.
What's the difference?
Nervousness is about what might happen. That feeling was about what had already happened and I'd missed. He paused. "I don't miss things often. It bothered me."
You didn't miss it. You just hadn't looked in the right place yet.
"No, you looked in the right place. I was too close to see it." Hannah turned to face him fully. "Is that why you're doing this tonight? The announcement?" Julian met her eyes. "I'm doing this tonight because it's the truth. You changed the way this organization operates. You identified a threat that my own senior staff missed. You pushed me to hold my people accountable instead of protecting loyalty for its own sake. Every person in this building tonight benefits from decisions you made in the first 2 weeks of knowing me. That deserves recognition, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise just because it might surprise people." Hannah held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at the skyline.
My family spent my whole life treating me like I was taking up space. I got used to it. I learned how to make myself smaller so I wouldn't bother anyone. And then you showed up at a gala and said my name in front of 300 people, and I've been trying to figure out ever since whether I'm allowed to take up this much room.
You are.
I'm starting to believe that.
The guests began arriving at 7:30. They came in small groups, stepping off the elevator onto the observation deck, with the slightly odd expressions of people entering a space they hadn't known existed. The copper dome above them caught the ambient light from the city and held it like a warm ceiling. And the terrace doors had been propped open so the night air moved freely through the room. Hannah greeted every guest personally. She knew most of them by name, having spent the past week reviewing Julian's client files and foundation records, so she could speak to each person about their specific work. The director of a regional food bank received an update on supply chain improvements that would affect his distribution schedule. A shelter network coordinator from the suburbs learned that 3 new facilities had been approved for construction in underserved areas, funded through the same foundation structure that protected Hannah's own rescue operation. A commercial shipping partner who had lost 2 major deliveries to Marcus's scheme was assured, face-to-face, that the goods had been recovered and replacement shipments were already in transit. Julian watched her work the room from near the terrace entrance. Cole stood beside him, arms folded, observing the crowd with his usual professional attention. "She's good at this," Cole said.
She's better than good.
She sees people the way she sees logistics. Every detail matters, and nothing gets overlooked. At 8:15, Julian stepped to the center of the observation deck and raised his glass. The room settled into quiet attention, 40 faces turning toward him under the copper dome.
I'll keep this brief, because most of you know I prefer working to talking, Julian said, earning a few smiles around the room. 6 months ago, this organization had a problem I didn't know about. A breach of trust inside my own leadership that was costing us clients, credibility, and the operational integrity my father spent 30 years building. The person who identified that problem, who documented it carefully and brought it to me at personal risk, is standing in this room tonight. He looked at Hannah. She was standing near the glass railing, her hands clasped in front of her, her expression steady.
Hannah Belmont walked into my life 25 days ago, and in that time she has demonstrated more integrity, more courage, and more genuine intelligence than most people I've worked with in a decade. She didn't do it to impress anyone. She did it because that's who she is, because she pays attention when other people look away, and she tells the truth when it would be easier to stay quiet. Julian raised his glass higher. Effective tonight, Hannah is my full and equal partner in every legitimate enterprise this organization operates. Her judgment carries the same authority as mine. Her decisions stand without requiring my approval. If you trust me, then trust her, because she's earned it in ways that most of us never will. The room raised their glasses. The applause that followed was genuine, the kind that comes from people who understand what they're clapping for, because they've seen the evidence firsthand. Hannah crossed the room and stood beside Julian. He extended his hand. She took it and held it firmly, the same way she'd held it in the shelter office 3 weeks ago, when a handshake between them had been the beginning of something neither of them had fully understood yet. She looked out through the glass at the city below, its towers lit up against the dark sky, its streets carrying 10 million ordinary lives through an ordinary evening. Somewhere down there, a shelter full of rescued animals was sleeping soundly in a building that nobody could take away. Somewhere down there, her family was sitting in a garden that no longer felt like enemy territory. And here, on the top floor of a building that sat between the earth and the sky, a woman who had spent her entire life being underestimated was standing exactly where she belonged. The evening went on. Conversations continued, plans were made, and the future took shape around a table where every voice carried equal weight.
And the city, which had spent 25 days asking a single question, finally had its answer. Why her? Because she was always the right choice. Everyone else had simply been looking in the wrong direction.